If you were the easy child, the one who never cried, never demanded, and never made a fuss, you might be paying a heavy psychological tax today that you don't even realize you owe. There is a quiet, uncomfortable truth about children who grow up ignored. They don't just disappear into the background. They turn into adults who fundamentally struggle to believe they deserve to take up space in the world. You might walk into a meeting and feel an immediate, instinctive need to shrink. You might enter a relationship and constantly wonder if your needs are too much or if your presence is a burden. And when you succeed, when you get the promotion, the praise, or the love, instead of celebrating, you wait for it to be overlooked, as if invisibility is your natural state. If this resonates, you aren't broken. You are operating on a blueprint that was drawn years ago. Psychologists call this an internalized neglect schema. It means your brain has physically wired itself to expect silence, to anticipate dismissal, and to assume that having needs is a mistake. But here is the paradox. The child who is ignored often becomes the adult who saves everyone else while quietly starving themselves of connection. Today, we are going to dismantle that silence. We are going to look at the neuroscience of why this happens, how it manifests in your 30s and 40s, and how to finally break the cycle. Let's start with a painful reality that we rarely discuss. Childhood neglect doesn't always look like abuse. It doesn't always look like cruelty or shouting or chaos. In fact, for many of you watching this, your childhood might have looked perfectly normal on the outside. There was food on the table. There were no major tragedies. But inside the home, there was an absence. Sometimes it is simply the unanswered questions, the lack of eye contact, the forgotten birthday, or the parent who was just too busy, too tired, or too distracted to notice you were there. It is the cumulative weight of 1,000 moments where you reached out for connection and grasped nothing but air. And because children are brilliant at survival, a child who is ignored enough times eventually learns a devastating lesson. They learn not to ask. They convince themselves that wanting love, affection, or simple understanding is somehow wrong. You might see this on a playground or in a classroom. The child who doesn't cry the loudest, who doesn't demand attention, but instead retreats into silence. To the outside world, they look like the good kid. They are low maintenance. They are easy. But inside that child's mind, a deep fracture is forming in the foundation of their self-worth. This matters because we often assume children are resilient. We tell ourselves, oh, kids bounce back. And yes, children do adapt. But we have to make a critical distinction here. Adaptation is not the same as healing. When you learn to live without acknowledgement, you adapt by shrinking. You adapt by hiding your needs. You adapt by convincing yourself you don't matter as much as the other people in the room. And while that adaptation allows you to survive childhood, it quietly haunts your adulthood in ways you may not even recognize. Let's look at the science, because this isn't just feelings. This is biology. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that human beings need 3 core things to thrive: safety, stimulation, and connection. If connection is missing, if you aren't seen, heard, and valued, your development is affected. John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, argued that secure attachment is the foundation of trust. When a caregiver consistently responds to a child, that child learns that the world is safe and that they are valuable. But if a child is ignored, if their needs are met with silence or inconsistency, they don't just feel disappointed in that specific moment. They internalize a dangerous belief. Maybe I don't deserve love. Maybe I'm not important. And this isn't an exaggeration. Studies in neuroscience show that when a child's attempts at connection are repeatedly ignored, their brain actually interprets it as a threat. Think about that. Silence is processed as a threat. The stress response activates. Cortisol floods the tiny body. And over time, if this happens enough, it rewires the nervous system to expect rejection. Your baseline becomes anxiety. Your emotional regulation becomes fragile. You might stop asking questions because you expect no answer. You might stop showing excitement because no one responds. Psychologists call this emotional neglect. Unlike physical neglect, which leaves visible scars, emotional neglect leaves scars hidden beneath the surface. These scars often don't fully appear until you are an adult, trying to build intimacy, chase a dream, or find meaning, and you run straight into the quiet, unhealed wounds of the past. So, what does this look like in your life today? Many adults who grew up feeling ignored report deep struggles with self-esteem, but it's more specific than just low confidence. It's a hesitation to share thoughts because you believe nobody really cares. It's a fear of rejection so deep that you might avoid relationships altogether. Or interestingly, it can manifest as the opposite. You might desperately chase approval, bending over backwards to keep others happy, because deep down, you are still trying to earn the acknowledgement you missed as a child. Let's run a simulation. Imagine being 8 years old. You run home from school with a drawing you are incredibly proud of. You hold it up to show your parent, but they are busy on the phone. You wait. You try again at dinner, but the conversation passes you by. Eventually, you put the drawing away and you never mention it again. Now, imagine this happening not once, but dozens, even hundreds of times over a childhood. What is the lesson? The lesson is that excitement, pride, and joy are things best kept to yourself. Fast forward 30 years. You are now an adult who struggles to celebrate your own successes, dismissing them as unimportant. The ignored child becomes the adult who ignores themselves. This is confirmed by data. A 2019 study in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that emotional neglect in childhood is strongly correlated with chronic feelings of loneliness in adulthood, regardless of your social environment. This is the key takeaway. You can have friends, a family, and a partner, and still feel a quiet emptiness lingering inside, because the loneliness isn't about who is around you. It's about who is inside you. We need to have some empathy here for the parents, which might feel difficult, but it's necessary for understanding the context. Most parents who ignore their children don't do so out of cruelty. Often, it is the result of stress, economic hardship, mental health struggles, or simply not understanding how critical acknowledgement is. A parent working 2 jobs has little emotional energy left. A parent dealing with depression may struggle to notice their child's bids for attention. And in our modern age, digital distractions, phones, screens, notifications pull focus away from family life constantly. However, and this is crucial, intention doesn't erase impact. To the child, the absence feels the same, regardless of why it happens. The brain doesn't say, "Mom is just stressed about the mortgage." The brain says, "I am invisible." This brings us to the coping mechanisms. Ignored children develop strategies to survive, and at first glance, these strategies can look like strengths. First, there is the fiercely independent. Some children learn to take care of themselves early. They become self-sufficient. They don't ask for help. As adults, they are the ones who have it all together. But beneath that independence is often exhaustion. The independent child grows into an adult who struggles to trust others. Second, there is the high achiever. These children strive to finally earn the acknowledgement they crave through performance. If they can just get the best grades, win the trophy, or get the high-paying job, maybe then they will be seen. As adults, they become perfectionists, never satisfied, always chasing the next milestone. Third, there is the peacekeeper. These children avoid conflict at all costs to keep a fragile sense of connection alive. They become the people pleasers, unable to say no, flattening their own personalities to fit what others need. And perhaps the most heartbreaking adaptation is the child who stops trying altogether, the one who concludes, "If no one cares anyway, why bother?" This child often carries apathy into adulthood, struggling with motivation, ambition, and hope. These mechanisms are why ignored children rarely talk about their experience. How do you explain what it feels like to be invisible? There is no dramatic story to tell. There is no event to point to. There are no scars to show, just silence. Just the memory of moments that should have mattered but didn't. This silence becomes a barrier to healing. Adults who grew up ignored often hesitate to seek help because they fear being dismissed again. In therapy, they minimize their experiences, saying things like, "Nothing really bad happened to me," or "I had a roof over my head, I shouldn't complain." But we have to reframe this. The absence of something essential is, in itself, a trauma. It is like growing up in a house without air. Just because you survive doesn't mean you are breathing freely. The long-term effects are real and measurable. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health shows that adults who experienced emotional neglect are at higher risk of anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming close relationships. Another study from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child points out that consistent acknowledgement strengthens neural pathways related to resilience, while neglect weakens them. Put simply, acknowledgement is not a luxury. It is a developmental necessity. But this doesn't mean every ignored child is doomed. In fact, many grow into compassionate, thoughtful adults precisely because they know what it feels like to be unseen. But it does mean their journey is harder. It means they have to spend years unlearning beliefs that were planted in them before they even knew how to question them. So, where does healing begin? It doesn't begin with perfection. It doesn't begin with instantly becoming confident. It begins with recognition. It begins with the simple but powerful act of saying to yourself, "What happened to me mattered. My needs were real. My pain is valid." For the ignored child who grew into an adult, the first step is often giving themselves the acknowledgement they didn't receive. This sounds abstract, I know. Love yourself is a cliche, but this is practical. It can be as small as pausing to celebrate your own wins. When you finish a project, instead of immediately moving to the next one, take 10 seconds to say, "I did that." It can be as small as saying your feelings out loud, even if only to yourself. It can be as small as daring to believe that what you think and feel matters, because the truth is, acknowledgement isn't something you outgrow. The need to be seen doesn't vanish with age. It just goes underground. And the journey of healing is about bringing it back into the light. Think about how this shows up in your friendships right now. An ignored child often becomes the quiet friend who listens deeply but struggles to share their own struggles. They are the person who always shows up for others but rarely asks for support in return. To the outside world, they seem selfless, but inside there is a lingering ache. Why don't I matter as much as others? This isn't selfishness. It is simply a longing for balance that was never given. In romantic relationships, the patterns can be even more profound. Some adults who were ignored become desperate for affection, clinging tightly to anyone who shows them attention. Others go in the opposite direction, keeping emotional distance because closeness feels dangerous. Both reactions come from the same root, the fear that love will disappear, the expectation that needs will not be met. And yet, here is the paradox. The ignored child often becomes one of the most empathetic adults you will ever meet. They have a heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others. Studies in developmental psychology have shown that neglected children often develop strong observational skills. They learn to read faces, tones of voice, and small shifts in mood because their survival depended on it. They had to sense when it was safe to speak or when silence was the only option. That hyper-awareness can be a gift in adulthood. It makes you a great leader, a sensitive partner, a skilled negotiator, but it carries a heavy cost. You tune in to everyone else while tuning out yourself. There is another layer to this, one we rarely talk about. When a child is ignored, their sense of identity can remain blurry. They weren't mirrored back. Mirroring is when a parent reflects a child's emotions. I see you're sad. I see you're excited. Without that, thoughts and emotions don't feel real. So as adults, they may constantly search for validation, not because they are shallow, but because they were never given the chance to fully see themselves reflected in the love of another. Identity grows in connection. Without that reflection, selfhood becomes fragile. But here is where something remarkable happens. The human mind has a resilience that is almost poetic. Even when a child grows up ignored, they still carry a quiet hope. That is why you are watching this video. That is why so many ignored children seek healing, read books about psychology, and dive into self-discovery. They are not content to live in the silence they were raised in. They want to break it. That desire alone is proof of strength. Healing is possible. Neuroscience has shown us that the brain is not fixed. It adapts, changes, and rewires. This means that even if you grew up ignored, you can build new patterns. Every time you speak up and are heard, your brain registers safety. Every time you set a boundary and it is respected, your nervous system learns trust. Every moment of healthy connection becomes like a drop of water, wearing away the stone of old wounds. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like finally telling a friend, "I need you to listen to me right now." Sometimes it is daring to say, "I feel hurt," instead of swallowing the pain. Sometimes it is sitting alone and whispering to yourself, "My feelings matter," even if no one taught you that before. These small moments are actually revolutions because they push back against years of silence. None of this is easy. Ignored children often grow into adults who fear rejection more than anything, so speaking up can feel terrifying. Setting boundaries can feel like betrayal. Asking for help can feel like weakness, but the courage to do those things despite the fear is what slowly repairs the self. It is important to say this too. Parents who ignore their children are not always cruel. Sometimes they themselves were ignored. Sometimes they were overwhelmed, lost in their own struggles, or simply unaware of the impact of their absence. This doesn't excuse the wound, but it reminds us that cycles of neglect often stretch back through generations. When you begin to heal from being ignored, you are not only healing yourself, you are breaking a chain that may have lasted decades. Every ignored child who learns to listen to themselves becomes a parent, a friend, or a partner who listens better. Every ignored child who learns to value their needs becomes someone who teaches others that their needs matter too. Healing ripples outward, and this brings us to one of the most important truths. An ignored child often feels like their existence didn't leave a mark, but in reality, their story carries immense power. Their journey of invisibility and their fight to reclaim visibility can inspire others in ways they may never know. By sharing their truth, they remind others who have been silent that they are not alone. By daring to heal, they open the door for others to heal too. So, if you were that child, if you ever sat in your room waiting for someone to notice you, if you ever felt like your emotions were too heavy for anyone to carry, if you ever wondered whether your presence mattered, let me say this to you now. It mattered then, and it matters now. You matter now. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about giving yourself the love you deserved all along. It's about learning to see yourself not through the eyes of neglect, but through the eyes of compassion. It's about realizing that being ignored shaped you, but it does not define you. The psychology of the ignored child is a story of pain, yes, but also of extraordinary resilience. It is the story of how silence can create wounds, but also how breaking that silence can create wisdom. It is the story of how invisibility can feel like a curse, but can also fuel a deeper empathy, a deeper drive to connect, and a deeper hunger for truth. In the end, the child who was ignored often becomes the adult who refuses to ignore others. And in that choice, imperfect, messy, brave, they discover something profound. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. There is one more thing you need to know about this process. It requires patience. You are rewiring decades of neural pathways. Be gentle with yourself. If this conversation stirred something in you, I have a few small requests. First, take a breath. Acknowledge that just watching this was an act of self-care. Second, if you feel comfortable, share one small way you are learning to take up space in the comments below. Your story might be the permission slip someone else needs to start their own healing. And finally, if you want to understand more about how childhood shapes our adult emotional landscape, you should watch this video next.